Hello there, and welcome to Edge of Mind. Tonight, we are going somewhere that most of us have never truly been, even though every human being who came before us lived there every single evening of their lives. We are going into the dark, not the dim, softened dark of a modern bedroom with its glowing standby lights and the faint amber of street lamps pressing through the curtains. Something much older than that, something that has no equivalent in the world most of us wake up inside of now. We are going into a night that was complete. There was a time, not so very long ago in the span of human history, when darkness was not something you adjusted with a switch. It was something that arrived. It came the way weather comes. Gradually at first, and then all at once, and there was nothing to be done about it. The sun moved toward the horizon, and the world began its slow disappearance. And by the time the last of the light had gone, everything you knew was simply no longer visible. And before we go any further, I'd love to know where you are right now. What part of the world are you watching from tonight? Whether it's late where you are, or just getting quiet, drop it in the comments. It's always so lovely to see where these evenings find people. Consider what that meant, not as a poetic idea, but as a physical fact of daily life. A village in the countryside, sometime in the 15th or 16th century, on a night with no moon, the last of the daylight fading from the western edge of the sky. The fields going first, those wide open spaces losing their shape, their color, their distance, until there was simply a kind of formless weight where the land had been. Then the road, then the houses across the way, their outlines softening, and then dissolving entirely into the surrounding dim, and then, very soon after that, your own hands. That is the part that is almost impossible to hold in the mind now. The darkness was not merely dim. It was not the darkness of a room with the lights off, where the eyes gradually find the shapes of furniture and the pale rectangle of a window. On a moonless, overcast night in a world without artificial light, the darkness was absolute. There was nothing for the eyes to find, nothing to adjust to. A person standing in the open air could not see their own hand held before their face. This was not an occasional experience. This was every evening, every single night of a person's life. From the moment they were born until the moment they died, the world went completely dim for hours at a time. It was as reliable and as total as anything in nature. The sun went down, and the visible world ended, and that was simply the shape of existence. Inside a house, things were only slightly different. A fire in the hearth gave some light, a warm, unsteady, amber-colored light that reached perhaps as far as the middle of the room and left the corners in deep shadow. A candle, if you had one and could afford to burn it, gave a small circle of visibility that moved and wavered with every shift of air. But these things were precious, and they were limited, and they were not left burning carelessly through the night. Candles cost money, firewood cost labor, light was not something you wasted. So the darkness was always close, even indoors, even with a fire. The night pressed in from every direction, from the corners of the room, from the spaces beneath the furniture, from the ceiling above the reach of the flame. A house at night was a small island of dim warmth surrounded entirely by something vast and lightless. Outside, the darkness was something else entirely. It was not empty. It was full of sound, wind moving through the trees, animals in the fields, the distant murmur of water, the settling and creaking of wooden structures responding to the cooling air, but none of it was visible. The sounds arrived without any image to attach them to, which gave them a weight and a presence that is difficult to describe now. A sound in the dim is a different thing from a sound in the light. It is larger, somehow. It fills more space. A town was not much better than a village on those nights. The streets of a medieval or early modern town were narrow and unlit. There were no lamps on poles, no illuminated windows casting rectangles of light across the stones. The buildings rose on either side of the lanes and blocked whatever faint glow might have come from stars or a distant moon, leaving the streets between them in a darkness so complete that moving through them after nightfall was genuinely slow and difficult. People who needed to travel at night carried lanterns, small and fragile things, and their light reached only a few feet in any direction before it gave out entirely. Most people did not go out after the sun went down if they could help it. This was not merely a matter of preference. The night was a place where ordinary protections fell away. The social order that governed daytime life, the visibility of neighbors, the presence of witnesses, the ease of recognizing faces, all of that dissolved when the light went. What moved through the streets after nightfall was largely unknown, and what was unknown carried a weight that the daylight world did not, even inside, even settled and still. The darkness had a texture that most of us have lost the ability to feel. It pressed against the eyes in a way that open space does not. It made the room smaller, the walls closer, the sounds from outside more present. A house in total darkness was a different kind of space from a house in daylight. The same walls and floor and ceiling, but somehow more intimate, more enclosed, more aware of itself. And the sky above all of this was something most people alive today have never seen. A sky with no artificial light anywhere on the horizon. On a clear night, is not the sky that most of us know. It is dense with stars, not scattered points of light, but a continuous presence, a deep field of brightness that stretches from one edge of the horizon to the other, and woven through it all, the broad and faintly luminous river of the galaxy itself. People who lived before electricity did not have to travel anywhere to see this. It was simply the sky, every clear night. The stars were a kind of company, a familiar and unhurried ceiling that had been there every evening for as long as anyone could remember. And then clouds would come, and even that would go, and the darkness would become complete again. This was the world that people settled into when evening arrived, not with dread necessarily. They had known nothing else, and the body finds its way toward what it has always known, but with a kind of gravity, a recognition that the day was truly finished, that the part of life belonging to movement and labor and the visible world had ended, and the part belonging to stillness and fire and the nearness of the people around you had begun. There is something worth sitting with in that, the way the ending of light was also the beginning of something else, a different kind of time, a different kind of presence. The darkness did not take the world away so much as it replaced it with something smaller and warmer and more immediate, the circle of firelight, the sound of breathing nearby, the weight of the night pressing gently in from all sides. The last of the daylight was not something people watched slip away with indifference. It was a threshold, a real one. And what came after it, the hours of darkness that followed, the rituals and the routines, and the particular quality of life that belonged to those hours, was its own world entirely. A world that began, every evening, with the simple and total arrival of the dim. In those final minutes before full night settled in, people were already drawing inward toward the fire, toward the warmth, toward the small and quiet things that filled the last hour before sleep. The candle, if there was one, would be burning low, the fire would be tended carefully, banked down to last the night, and the household would begin, in its own unhurried way, to prepare for the long hours ahead. The fire had been burning all day, and by evening it had settled into something lower and steadier. Not the bright working fire of midday, but a quieter version of itself, giving off more warmth and light. Its glow spread softly across the nearest surfaces, and left everything beyond them in a warm and gathering dimness. This was the hour that belonged to no particular task. The work of the day was finished, the darkness outside was full and complete, and the household existed, for a little while, in the small amber world that the fire allowed, close together, unhurried, with nowhere else to go, and no light to take them there. A candle might be lit for a short while, someone might mend something by its light, or speak quietly with the people nearby, or simply sit with the warmth of it close at hand, but candles were not burned carelessly, and the evening did not stretch on the way a modern evening does. The darkness had a weight to it that moved people naturally toward stillness and toward rest. And so gradually, the fire would be tended one last time. The candle, if there was one, would be carefully extinguished, the household would draw together in the dim, and the long hours of sleep would begin. A candle might be lit for a short while, someone might mend something by its light, or speak quietly with the people nearby, or simply sit with the warmth of it close at hand. But candles were not burned carelessly. The evening did not stretch on the way a modern evening does. The darkness had a weight to it that moved people naturally toward stillness and toward rest. What filled that last hour before sleep was something quieter and more particular than we might expect. There were no books for most people, reading was rare, and the light too dim for it in any case. There were no instruments of distraction, no voices arriving from somewhere else. The evening simply was what it was: the fire, the people nearby, the sounds of the house settling around them. Conversation happened in that hour, though not the kind that covered great distances of thought. It was close and low, the kind of talking that belongs to people who are already tired, already warm, already leaning toward sleep. A few words about the day, a question asked without urgency, a silence that no one felt the need to fill. Children would have grown heavy-lidded near the fire, long before the adults were ready to sleep. Their bodies, still governed entirely by the rhythm of light and warmth, would begin to soften and slow, almost as soon as the evening gathered around them. There was no hour set for their bedtime, so much as a natural drawing down, a gradual yielding to the weight of the evening. One moment they were present, and then they were simply gone into sleep, the way small things go, without ceremony or resistance. The adults who remained would sit a while longer. Not long. The darkness pressed in, and the fire asked to be left alone to do its slow work through the night. But for a few minutes, the household existed in a kind of suspended quiet. The day was over. Sleep had not yet arrived, and there was a particular quality to that in-between space. A softness, a smallness, a sense of the world having narrowed to the size of a single warm room. The fire itself was never simply left. This was one of the small but serious rituals of the evening, banking the coals, covering the embers, making sure that what would keep the house warm through the night would not, in its warmth, consume it. Fire was the most necessary and the most dangerous thing in a household. It needed to be managed with care, even as everyone around it was moving toward sleep. Someone, usually the last person awake, would take a moment to tend it properly. They would press the coals together, lay ash over the surface to slow the burning, and ensure that morning would find something still alive in the hearth. It was a quiet and deliberate act, done in the dimness, with the rest of the household already still. This was not a small thing. A fire that went out in the night meant a cold house and a difficult morning, and so the last act of the evening carried a kind of weight that no modern equivalent quite matches. The turning off of a lamp is nothing, a small and thoughtless gesture, but banking the fire was an act of care, a small and patient negotiation with the night. The candle, if one had been burning, required its own attention. Candles were not extinguished carelessly. A carelessly snuffed candle could smolder and catch, the flame was pinched or carefully stilled, and the wax was left to harden in the cooling air. In the morning it would be there again, waiting to be relit, a small continuity between one evening and the next. These rituals, the fire, the candle, the quiet conversation, the gradual drawing down of the household, were not thought of as rituals. They were simply what the evening was. The shape of it had been the same for generations, and there was a kind of deep familiarity in that sameness. The body knew what the dimming fire meant. Sleep was not something that had to be sought or scheduled or negotiated with. It arrived, reliably, when the conditions for it had been met. Warmth, darkness, stillness, the presence of other breathing bodies nearby. There is something worth pausing with in that. The way sleep was not a destination so much as a natural consequence, a thing the body moved toward the way water moves toward lower ground, without effort and without resistance. The evening's rituals were not preparations for sleep, so much as the gradual removal of everything that stood between the body and its own deep inclination to rest. Modern sleep is so often a problem to be solved, a thing that requires management, the right temperature, the right darkness, the right silence, the deliberate winding down from a day that never fully stopped. For most of human history, the winding down was simply the evening itself. The light went, the fire settled, the warmth gathered close, and sleep followed, as naturally as one thing follows another. The sounds of that last hour were particular too. A house at the edge of sleep has its own voice, the low murmur of a fire finding its slower rhythm, the occasional settling of a timber, the soft and irregular sounds of breathing nearby. Outside, if you listened, there was the wider world of the night, wind moving through whatever grew close to the walls, the distant sound of an animal somewhere in the dim, the occasional voice of someone passing on a road, already slightly unreal in the way that nighttime voices always are. These sounds were familiar. They had always been there, every night without variation. And familiarity is its own kind of comfort, not the comfort of silence, but the comfort of knowing each sound and understanding it. The house spoke, and the people inside it had learned to hear those sounds as reassurance. This creak meant nothing. That sound from outside was only the wind. The fire was low and safe, and doing what it was meant to do. There was a closeness to that hour that is difficult to recover now. Not just the physical closeness of people sharing a small warm space, but a closeness to the evening itself, to the particular quality of firelight on a familiar wall, to the smell of wood smoke and the faint trace of whatever had been cooked earlier, to the weight of a day that had been lived entirely within a small radius of that fire. In that house, among those people, the world was very near, in those last minutes before sleep, near and warm and known, and then, gradually, even that nearness would soften and dissolve. The last voice would fall quiet, the last movement would slow and still. One by one, the people in that room would cross the threshold that no one ever quite notices crossing. The place where wakefulness ends, and something else begins, not with any clear border. Simply a gradual release, the way a hand opens slowly when it is no longer held. The fire would go on burning low in its careful way. The house would go on making its small sounds, and outside, the full weight of the night would continue, wide and dim and unhurried, moving at its own pace through the hours between sunset and whatever came after. What came after, for most people, was a sleep unlike the one most of us know now. Not one long unbroken stretch, but something with a different shape entirely. Something that had its own middle, its own quiet interruption, its own particular and private hour of wakefulness in the deep of the night. But that is where we are going next, slowly, following the household into the first of its two sleeps. The first sleep was not gentle in the way we might imagine gentleness. It was heavy, a weight that settled over the body the way snow settles over a field, gradually and completely, until everything beneath it is still. People who worked with their hands from before the sun rose until long after it had gone did not ease into sleep so much as fall into it, the way something falls when it has been held up for a very long time and is finally allowed to let go. The body knew this kind of tiredness. It was not the restless, wired exhaustion of a mind that has been looking at bright things too late into the evening. It was something older and more complete, a tiredness that lived in the shoulders and the legs and the hands, in every part of the body that had been asked to carry the day, and when that tiredness met the warmth of a banked fire and the familiar sounds of a house settling into its nighttime quiet, sleep came without any need to be invited. It simply arrived, the way the darkness had arrived before it, not as an absence of something, but as a presence all its own, soft and full and very deep. And for a while, the household rested inside it completely. The household that slept together was not sleeping the way we sleep now, each person sealed inside their own room, their own bed, their own particular silence. The arrangement was different in almost every way. A bed, where one existed at all, was often the most valuable object in a home. It was passed down through families the way land was passed down, listed in wills, named in legal documents, treated with the kind of care reserved for things that could not easily be replaced. And into that bed, when the fire had burned low and the last sounds of the evening had settled, came not one person but several. A husband and wife, yes, but often the children as well, pressed close on either side or tucked in at the foot. In smaller homes, the arrangement was simply a matter of warmth. Bodies held heat in a way that blankets alone could not, and a cold night in a stone-walled house was not a thing to face alone, if you did not have to. The sharing was practical before it was anything else. It was the way the cold was managed, and the way the darkness was made a little less wide. But it was more than warmth. It was also the ordinary texture of how people understood themselves in relation to one another. The idea that sleep was a private act, something done alone, behind a closed door, in a room that belonged only to you, would have seemed strange to most people living before the last few centuries. Not wrong, exactly, simply strange. The way a custom from a distant place seems strange, not something to resist, just foreign to everything you have always known. In households with servants, those servants often slept nearby, not in a separate wing, not behind a wall of distance, but in the same room, or just beyond a narrow partition. A lady's maid might sleep at the foot of her employer's bed, or on a small pallet just inside the door. This was not considered an intrusion, it was simply the shape of the household, the way the different lives within it arranged themselves for the night, each one settling into its familiar place without ceremony or comment. At inns along the roads between towns, The arrangement was more striking still. A traveler arriving late might be shown to a room and find a stranger already sleeping in the only bed. The innkeeper would expect both guests to share it without complaint, and often they did, lying down on opposite sides, each keeping to their portion of the mattress. There was a quiet etiquette to this, certain understandings, unspoken but clear. You did not disturb the other person. You took your half of the warmth and left the rest alone. What is worth sitting with, slowly, is how much this changes the nature of sleep itself. We tend to think of sleep as something that happens to us alone, a private dissolving, a personal going away. The person sleeping beside us, if there is one, is still separate from us in that dissolving. We go somewhere they cannot follow, and we return from somewhere they have not been. The sleep is ours alone, even when the bed is shared. But in a room where several people slept together, the rhythms of sleep were woven together in a different way. One person stirring would shift the weight of the mattress and move the person beside them. A child waking in the night would wake the mother nearest to them. A restless sleeper would carry their restlessness into the body of the person they lay against. Sleep was not separate. It moved between people the way warmth moved between them, not belonging entirely to any one of them, but flowing softly through all. There was a particular kind of intimacy in that, and also a particular kind of exposure. You could not hide your sleep from the people around you. They heard the sounds you made. They felt the movements of your body through the long hours of the night. They knew in a way that no one knows about us now, the specific and private shape of your sleeping, how long it took to come, how deeply it settled, how you moved when the dreaming was happening somewhere beneath the surface. This was simply known, the way a family knows the sound of each other's voices, or the particular way each person moves through a room. It was not thought about, it was not discussed, it was simply part of the texture of being close to someone across the quiet hours of the night. Children grew up sleeping against the warmth of parents and siblings. They learned the rhythms of other bodies before they learned much else. The sounds of a sleeping household, the breathing, the small movements, the occasional murmur from somewhere inside a dream, were among the earliest sounds a person knew. They were the sounds that meant the night was ordinary, and the people nearby were still there. And when those children grew and formed households of their own, they carried that understanding with them. Sleep was not solitude. It was proximity. It was the continued presence of the people you belonged to, even in the hours when no one was speaking and the world had gone very still. For those who slept alone, the unmarried, the widowed, the traveler who had the road to themselves, the absence of that proximity was something that could be felt, not always as loneliness, exactly, but as a particular quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of a shared bed. A wider silence, the night arranged differently around a single body than it arranged itself around several. The mattresses themselves were nothing like what we know. Straw, often, or dried leaves or husks, packed into a linen casing that would flatten and shift over time and need to be restuffed. In wealthier homes, feathers, soft and deep and warm in a way that straw could not quite match. Even the finest bed of that era was a different thing from what we sleep on now, lower to the ground in many cases, heavier with blankets, and enclosed sometimes by curtains drawn around the four posts of the frame to hold the warmth in and the drafts of the room out. Inside those curtains, in the deepest part of the night, the darkness was almost complete. You were inside the bed the way you might be inside a small room within a room. The curtains moved slightly when someone else shifted. The warmth was the warmth of bodies and wool and the faint residual heat of a fire that had been banked hours before. It smelled of the people who slept there, and of the herbs sometimes tucked into the mattress, small, fragrant things placed there quietly as a kind of keeping. It was nothing like sleeping alone in a still modern room with a regulated temperature and a door that closes firmly against the rest of the world. It was closer and warmer and more full of the presence of other living things, less private, less still, and in some ways, perhaps, less lonely, though that word belongs to a later understanding of what sleep is supposed to be. The night held all of them together in that bed, in that room, in that house. Outside, the same wide darkness pressed against every window and wall. The same silence filled the narrow lanes between the houses. The same cold moved slowly through the fields and across the rooftops of the village, unhurried and indifferent to everything beneath it. Inside was warmth and proximity and the sound of breathing, Outside was everything else. And between those two things, the closeness of the shared bed and the immensity of the world beyond the walls, the night continued on its way, moving through its hours at the same slow pace it had always kept. The first of those hours, the ones that followed the crossing into sleep, were the heaviest ones. And it is there, into that first and deepest sleep, that the household now slowly descends. The weight of it settled gradually, the way sleep itself settles, not all at once, but in soft layers, each one a little heavier than the last. First the sounds of the household would soften, then the movements would grow still, then the breathing of the people nearby would deepen and slow into something long and even, and the room would become a place of pure, unhurried quiet. There was nothing to wait for, no light left to extinguish, no final thing to check before the night could truly begin. The darkness was already there, and the warmth was already there, and the people you belonged to were already close. Sleep did not need to be invited. It simply arrived, the way the cold arrived, or the silence, as something that had always been on its way, and had now finally come to rest. And so the household descended together into that first and deepest period of sleep. Bodies that had moved through the full hours of daylight grew heavy against the mattress. Breathing slowed. The small sounds of the house, the settling of timber, the faint movement of air beneath the door, continued on around them, unremarked and unheard. The night moved through its first long hours, and the people inside it moved through theirs. The darkness around them was absolute in a way that has almost no modern equivalent. Not the dimness of a room with curtains drawn, not the soft grey of a cloudy night in a city, but a blackness so complete that a hand held inches from the face disappeared entirely. The eyes, finding nothing to rest on, would search and find nothing, and gradually, even that searching would soften and release, and the body would accept what the darkness was offering, a kind of permission to stop. There was no resisting it. The dim pressed in from all sides, and the warmth of the bed pressed in from close, and the body, which had been working since before the light came up that morning, simply gave way, not reluctantly, not after a long negotiation with a restless mind. The body of someone who had spent the day in physical labor, in the cold, in the repetition of work that used every muscle steadily from dawn to dusk, did not need to be coaxed into sleep. It needed only the chance. And so the descent was genuine, heavy and full, the way sleep is only when the body has truly earned it. The sounds of the house continued for a while around them. Timber shifted in the walls as the temperature fell. Something small moved in the thatch above. A dog settled itself somewhere near the door with a long, low exhale. These sounds did not disturb the sleepers. They were the sounds the house had always made, the sounds that had accompanied every night of their lives, and they wove themselves into the quiet, the way familiar things do, not as interruptions, but as part of the fabric of the place itself. Outside, the village had grown very still. The lanes between the houses were empty and unlit. There were no lanterns burning at the corners, no distant glow from a window across the way. Every household had, one by one, banked its fire and settled into the dim, and the whole small world of the village had folded inward on itself, the way a flower folds at the end of the day, not gone, but gathered and waiting. The fields beyond the last houses stretched away into a darkness that had no edge. The trees at the field's boundary were invisible. The road that led toward the next village was invisible. The sky above, if there were clouds, offered nothing, and even on a clear night, the stars gave a cold, faint light that illuminated nothing below them, only reminded you of how far away everything luminous was. The world had become a place of surfaces you could not see, and distances you could not measure, and the people sleeping inside their houses were, in that sense, entirely inside, held by walls and warmth and one another, while the immensity of the unlit world continued all around them without witness. This was the first sleep, and it was deep in a way that is worth staying with for a moment. The body that descended into it carried the full weight of the day, not the particular kind of tiredness that comes from sitting too long in one position, or from staring at a bright screen until the eyes ache, but a tiredness that lived in the muscles themselves, in the shoulders and the hands and the backs of the legs, a tiredness that was almost a satisfaction, because it was the direct result of work that had been completed. The wood had been cut, or the bread had been shaped, or the fields had been walked and tended. The body knew this, and the body was ready. First sleep arrived early by any measure we would recognize today, an hour, perhaps two, after full darkness, which in winter might mean the household was asleep well before what we would call 9 o'clock in the evening. There was no reason to remain awake. The fire was low. The candle, if there had been one, was extinguished. The dim was everywhere, and the dim offered nothing to stay awake for. What the body entered in those first hours was its deepest rest. The kind of sleep that is almost impossible to disturb, that pulls the sleeper so far down into itself that the sounds of the house, the movements of the person sleeping beside them, the cold that crept in through gaps in the wall, none of it reached them. The mind had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere without images or words, somewhere quiet and without dimension. The face in sleep grew smooth and still, and the breathing slowed to something long and even and almost imperceptible. Hours passed this way. Not 1 hour, but several. The first sleep was long and uninterrupted, and it held the sleeper with a kind of completeness that is difficult to describe, like something close to the feeling of return that came with waking in the morning, which is perhaps why so many old prayers asked for protection across the hours of sleep, and why morning carried something of the feeling of having come back from somewhere very far away. The cold deepened as the night moved forward. In an unheated room, the temperature fell steadily through those first hours, and the sleepers drew closer together without waking, the way animals do, instinctively, without thought, simply following the warmth. The shared bed, which might have felt like an intrusion to a more recent sensibility, was in those cold hours simply a practical grace. Bodies generated warmth. Proximity preserved it. The arrangement made sense in the way that most old arrangements made sense, not because someone had designed it, but because it had survived long enough to prove itself. The animals of the house, if there were any, a dog, sometimes a cat, occasionally livestock in an adjoining space, moved through their own version of the same quiet. Their breathing added itself to the room. Their warmth added itself to the warmth. The household, in the deepest hours of first sleep, was a single gathered thing, all of its members moving through the dim together, each in their own inner silence, and yet none of them entirely alone. Outside, the night continued its slow work. The temperature fell further. Frost formed along the edges of the window, tracing its slow patterns across the glass or the oiled cloth that served in its place. The road was empty. The fields were still. Somewhere at the edge of the village, a dog might stir and settle again. An owl moved through the air above the rooftops, unhurried and without sound. The hours accumulated in the dim, one after another, each one indistinguishable from the last. And then, somewhere in the middle of all that gathered quiet, something shifted. Not a sound from outside, not a disturbance of any kind. Simply the body, having completed what it needed from those first deep hours, beginning to rise back toward the surface on its own. Slowly, the way something rises through water, without urgency, without knowing quite where it is going. The sleep that had been so absolute began to thin at its edges. The mind, which had been nowhere at all, began to return to something closer to itself. This was not waking in the way we understand it. It was softer than that, and stranger, a kind of in-between place that had its own particular quality of stillness. The room was still dim, the fire was lower, the people nearby were still breathing their long, slow breaths, and yet something had changed. Some threshold had been crossed in the quiet, and the sleeper now lay in a state that was neither fully asleep nor fully awake, hovering somewhere between the two in the middle of a night that had no light in it anywhere. What happened in that space, what people did with that hour, how they moved through it, what they thought and felt and reached for in the dim, is something worth arriving at slowly, because it was not nothing. It was, for many people across many centuries, one of the most private and unguarded hours of the entire day, an hour that belonged only to the dark and to themselves, suspended between one sleep and the next, in the deep middle of a night that had no light in it anywhere. That hour is where we are going next. The silence in that hour had a texture to it that the waking hours never quite carried. During the day, silence was always temporary, something between sounds, something waiting to be filled. But the silence of the middle night was different. It had settled into itself completely, the way still water settles, and it asked nothing of the person lying inside it. The body, having given so much to that first deep descent, now rested differently, lighter, closer to the surface, aware in some dim and wordless way of the room around it. The weight that had pulled the sleeper down so completely in those first hours had softened into something more like floating. The mind moved slowly through half-formed shapes, through the faint residue of the day, through nothing in particular. The cold had reached its lowest point. The fire was little more than embers now, a faint orange warmth at the edge of the room, enough to know it was still there. The darkness was total, and the darkness was familiar, and it had been there long enough that it no longer felt like an absence. It felt simply like the world, the way the world was, the way it had always been in these hours. And somewhere inside that familiar dim, the sleeper lay still, breathing slowly, neither here nor gone, suspended in the quiet middle of a night that had many hours yet to offer. Some rose from the bed, not with urgency, not with any particular purpose pulling them upright, but simply because the body had finished what it needed from that first descent, and now it was ready for something else. The movement was slow and familiar, the way a person moves when they have made the same movement many times before in the same dim room, a hand reaching for the edge of the blanket, a foot finding the floor, the cold of the boards beneath bare skin, present and grounding and real. Others stayed where they were, lying on their backs in the stillness, eyes open to a darkness so complete that open eyes and closed eyes felt nearly the same. Just the faint ember glow at the edge of the room, just the slow breathing of whoever lay beside them, just the weight of the blanket and the quiet and the hours. This was the watch. This was the hour that belonged to no one, and to everyone who had ever lived inside a night like this one. It had its own particular rhythm, softer than the rhythm of the waking day. No obligations waited in it. No one was expected anywhere. The world outside was as still as it would ever be, and the world inside the house had grown quieter still. The person lying or sitting in the middle of all that gathered silence was, for this 1 hour, entirely free, in a way that the daylight hours rarely allowed, free in the way that only the middle of the night can make a person free, when everything that needs doing has been set aside, and everything that will need doing has not yet arrived, and there is nothing left but the present moment, and the dim. Many reached for prayer, not in a formal or effortful way, but in the natural way that prayer comes when the mind is unguarded and the room is very still, words spoken quietly into the dim, or not spoken at all, simply held, the way you might hold something small and important in a closed hand. The church had long recognized this hour as sacred, and monks had built their entire schedules around it, rising in the deep middle of the night, to pray in the cold and the silence before returning to sleep. For ordinary people in ordinary houses, the prayer that rose in this hour was less structured than that, but no less sincere. It was simply the natural thing to do when the world had gone quiet, and the mind had come back to itself, and there was nothing between the person and whatever they believed in, except the dim. Some lay still and simply thought, the kind of thinking that only arrives in that hour, slow and unhurried, following no particular path. A worry that had been sharp during the day would return in a softer form, and the mind would turn it over gently, examining it from different angles without the urgency that daylight brought. A memory might rise, clear and complete, from somewhere it had been resting. A decision that had seemed impossible in the afternoon would sometimes resolve itself quietly in this hour, without effort, the way a knot loosens when you stop pulling at it. There was no word for this kind of thinking in most languages. It simply happened, and people accepted it as part of what the night offered. The watch was not considered strange or inconvenient. It was woven into the fabric of how a night unfolded, the way the tide is woven into the fabric of the shore. Historical records from across many centuries mention it plainly, without explanation, the way you might mention stopping for water on a long walk. A historian named Robert Eckerk spent years gathering these references, finding them scattered through diaries, court records, medical texts, and letters, ordinary people describing the hour between sleeps as a natural and expected part of the night, not as a disruption of it. Couples turned toward each other. The hour between sleeps was considered, in many traditions, a particularly fitting time for intimacy. The body warm and unhurried, the mind released from the pressures of the day, the darkness offering its particular kind of privacy, even in a shared room. Medical writers of earlier centuries recommended it. The reasoning was practical and a little tender. The body was rested enough to be present and relaxed enough to be gentle, and the sleep that followed was said to be among the deepest of the night. Some rose and did small things. A woman might go to check on an infant sleeping in a cradle nearby, placing a hand gently on the small warm back to feel the rise and fall of breath. A man might add a piece of wood to the fire, not to bring the room back to its earlier warmth, but simply to keep the embers alive a little longer, to hold back the cold by degrees. Someone might drink a little water, or step quietly to the window and look out at a darkness that offered nothing back. These were not tasks. They were simply movements, the body finding small ways to be present in the world before returning to sleep. And some simply lay in the dim and existed, not thinking in any directed way, not praying, not reaching for anything, just breathing slowly in the stillness, aware of the room around them, aware of the night, aware of being alive in the middle of it. There is something in that, in the image of a person lying quietly in total darkness, not trying to sleep, not trying to do anything at all, simply inhabiting the hour, that feels both very distant and very close, very old, and somehow familiar. The silence in this hour was not empty. It had a quality that is difficult to describe, because there is almost no modern equivalent for it. The nearest thing might be the silence of a house in the very early morning, when everyone else is asleep and you are briefly, unexpectedly awake, that particular quality of aloneness that is not loneliness, that particular awareness of the world continuing quietly around you, while you hover in a space that belongs to no part of the day. But even that comparison falls short. The silence of a modern house at that hour still contains the hum of a refrigerator, the faint glow of a streetlight through a curtain, the distant sound of a car somewhere on an empty road. The silence of the pre-electric night contained none of those things. It was simply silence, all the way down in every direction. And the person lying inside it knew it well, had known it every night of their life, had been born into a world where this was simply what night was, not a gap in the light, not an inconvenience to be managed, but a full and complete world of its own, with its own textures and its own rhythms and its own particular kind of company. The watch did not last long. An hour, perhaps a little more. The body knew, without being told, when it was time to return. The mind would begin to soften again at the edges, the thoughts growing less clear, the images behind the eyes beginning to blur into something looser and less deliberate. The cold would have deepened by now, the room at its stillest, the night at its most complete, and the sleeper would feel the pull of the second descent beginning, not as a decision, but as a gradual yielding, the way a person yields to warmth when they have been cold for a long time. They would settle back into the blankets, or they had never left them. They would find the familiar shape of the pillow, the familiar weight of the person beside them, the familiar sound of the house breathing in the dim, and slowly, without effort, the watch would end the way it had always ended, not with a choice, but with a dissolving, the waking mind releasing its hold on the hour, and letting the night take them back down again. What waited in that second sleep was different from the first, deeper in some ways, stranger in others. The dreams that came in those remaining hours before dawn were not the fleeting impressions of early sleep. They were longer, more fully formed, more vivid in their unfolding, and to the people who moved through them, they carried a weight that the waking world was expected to take seriously. For now, it is enough to stay here, inside the watch, inside this quiet hour that belonged to no category, that was neither sleeping nor waking, but something that moved gently between the two, a space that opened every night in the middle of ordinary lives, in ordinary rooms, in the deep and total silence of a world that had no other light to offer. People moved through it without thinking of it as unusual, without naming it as something to be preserved or protected. It was simply there, the way the dim was there, the way the cold was there, a natural part of what a night contained. There is something worth sitting with in that, the idea that for most of human history, the night had a middle, a soft and private center where the mind surfaced, rested briefly in the dim, and then released itself back into sleep, not a disruption, not a failure of the body to do what it was supposed to do. Simply the night, unfolding the way it always had, in two long movements, with a quiet breath between them. The second sleep was already beginning to gather at the edges of the hour, drawing the sleeper gently back toward the deeper part of the night, toward the long and vivid dreaming that waited in those last hours before the world began, very slowly to return. The second sleep was a different country entirely. Not in the way that sleep changes from night to night, or the way a dream shifts its scenery without warning, but in something more fundamental than that. The first sleep had been a yielding, a sinking, the body releasing the weight of the day the way a stone settles into soft ground. This was different. The mind that returned to sleep after the watch was not the same mind that had first gone under. It had surfaced briefly, breathed, turned a few quiet thoughts over in the dim, and now it descended again carrying something it had not carried before. A kind of readiness, a looseness, as though the brief waking had prepared it for what the deeper hours would bring. The body would have been warm by now. Whatever cold had gathered during the watch was slowly softened by the blankets and by the nearness of whoever lay beside. The room would have been at its most silent. Outside, the animals had long since stilled, and the village sounds had dissolved hours ago into the general quiet of a world that had no reason to stay awake. And inside that silence, the second sleep would begin to unfold the way something unfolds when it has been waiting patiently, not with any announcement, but with a gradual deepening that the sleeper would barely notice until they were already inside it. What came in those hours was not the same as what had come before. The dreams of first sleep, when they arrived at all, were often brief and loosely formed, impressions more than narratives, images without much weight behind them. The mind in early sleep was still close to the surface, still trailing threads of the day's ordinary texture. But the dreams that gathered in the second sleep were different in kind. They were longer, more fully rendered. They moved with a logic of their own that felt, from the inside, entirely coherent, and they left behind something upon waking that the earlier dreams rarely did, a residue, a feeling that persisted into the morning, coloring the first hours of the day with whatever mood the dream had carried. People noticed this, and over many generations, across many different places and ways of living, they drew conclusions from it. The dreams of these later hours were taken seriously in a way that is difficult to fully recover now. Living as we do in a time when dreams are generally considered private and mostly without meaning, the mind sorting through its accumulated noise. For much of human history, that understanding would have seemed not just incomplete, but genuinely mistaken. Dreams were not noise, they were a form of communication, arriving from somewhere the waking mind could not reach on its own. Some believed they came from the dead, from those who had passed out of the world but not entirely out of reach, who could only find a way through in the deepest and most open hours of the night. A message from a parent gone for years, a warning from a grandparent, something unfinished, offered across the distance between the living and the no longer living in the only hour when the boundary between those two states grew soft enough to allow it. Others understood the dreams of second sleep as arriving from elsewhere entirely, from a divine source, from the movements of fate, from something larger than any individual life that was using the sleeping mind as a surface on which to write what was coming. A dream of water might carry one meaning, a dream of fire, another, a dream of a particular face, someone known, someone unfamiliar, could occupy a person's waking thoughts for days, turned over carefully, shared with those who might help interpret it, treated with the same seriousness one might give to a letter arriving from a distant authority. There were people whose particular gift was the reading of these dreams, not charlatans, or not only charlatans, but men and women who had spent years learning the language of what the night produced. They could sit with a dream and find in it something the dreamer had not been able to see alone. Their work was considered as practical as the work of a healer or a midwife. The dream had arrived. It carried something. The question was what? This was not superstition in the way the word is sometimes used now, as a gentle dismissal of what people once believed before they knew better. It was a genuine and carefully maintained relationship with a part of human experience that was considered real and consequential and worthy of sustained attention. The night produced things, the sleeping mind received them, and the waking person was responsible for taking what had been received and doing something with it. A farmer who dreamed of a particular field flooding might alter where he planted in the spring. A woman who dreamed of a child she had lost might wake with a sense of having been visited, not haunted, not disturbed, but genuinely met, in the only place where such a meeting remained possible. A traveler who dreamed of something unsettling on the road ahead might choose a different route, or delay his departure, or simply carry the feeling with him as something to remain watchful of. These were not small things. They were woven into the texture of how decisions were made, how grief was carried, how the future was navigated, and they arrived, reliably and specifically, in the hours of second sleep, in those remaining hours between the watch and the first pale suggestion of dawn, when the mind was deepest in its own interior and most open to whatever the night had to offer. There was something in the timing of it that made a particular kind of sense, even if the people who lived inside it would not have described it in these terms. The body had already slept. The first urgency of rest had been satisfied. The watch had offered a brief interval of quiet wakefulness, and now, returning to sleep without the weight of exhaustion pressing down, the mind was free to move differently, to range further, to linger longer inside a single image or sequence, to follow a thread of dreaming all the way to its end, rather than losing it in the shallower water of early sleep. The dreams had room in those hours. They were not crowded out by the body's need to simply recover. They could unfold at their own pace, in their own direction, without being drawn back to the surface. And so they did, longer, stranger, more fully inhabited than anything the earlier hours had produced. A person lying in the dim of second sleep, in a room shared with others, in a house surrounded by the complete and total silence of a night without artificial light, was somewhere genuinely difficult to imagine now, not just in the physical sense, the cold, the closeness, the absence of any glow from any source, but in the interior sense. The relationship with what the sleeping mind produced was entirely different. It was attended to. It was considered a kind of knowledge, arriving through the only door that stayed open when the waking world had closed. Whatever the dream brought, comfort or unease, clarity or a soft confusion, it would be carried out of sleep and into the morning as something that mattered, held carefully, examined in the early light, perhaps shared with the person who had lain beside through the night, their own dreams offering their own separate weight of meaning or feeling or simple strangeness. And through all of it, the night was slowly, almost without any perceptible sign, beginning to change. Not in any way the sleeper would notice from inside the second sleep. The room would have remained as dim, as still, as sealed against the outside world as it had been for hours. But somewhere beyond the walls in the wide and lightless world, something was beginning to shift. The deepest part of the night had passed. The hours were moving, as they always moved, towards something the sleeper could not yet sense, but that was already on its way. A gradual, unhurried returning of the world to itself, moving so slowly that it would be some time yet before anyone inside those quiet rooms would feel it arriving. The body, somewhere in those final hours before dawn, was moving through a different kind of depth, one that felt less like absence and more like a slow interior wandering. The dreaming of these hours had a quality of fullness to it, as though the mind had finally found enough room to follow its own paths without being called back. It was not the same rest as the early part of the night had offered. It was something else, something more like movement than stillness, more like ranging than recovering. And the room around the sleeper held all of it quietly. The breathing of others nearby, the faint settling of walls and beams in the cold, whatever warmth remained from the fire, banked hours before, still faintly present in the air, though the chill had long since begun to gather at the edges of the room, a world entirely sealed, entirely still, entirely its own. Second sleep did not end with any particular announcement. There was no boundary the sleeper crossed, no moment of clear transition. The dreaming simply grew thinner, the way a morning mist thins as the air begins to warm, not dissolving all at once, but gradually becoming less dense, less vivid, until the images it carried softened into something harder to hold. The mind was beginning, without knowing it, to turn back toward the surface, and beyond the walls, the world was beginning, just barely, to do the same. Dawn did not arrive the way we might expect it to arrive now. There was no single moment when it appeared, no switch, no clear line between the night and what came after it. It came the way very slow things come, not as an event, but as a gradual softening of everything that had been so absolute for so many hours. The first sign was not light at all. It was sound. Before anything became visible, the world outside began to stir in small and almost imperceptible ways. A bird, somewhere in the trees beyond the house, would begin. Not a full song, not the chorus that would come later, but a single tentative note, as if testing whether the silence was ready to receive it. Then another bird, further away, then a faint shifting of wind through whatever leaves or thatch remained above the rooftops. The world was beginning to remember itself, and it did so quietly, from the outside in, long before any light had reached the windows. Inside the room, the sleeper would not have noticed any of this at first. The dreaming was still thinning, still releasing its hold on the mind in the slow way it had always done in those final hours. But somewhere below the level of conscious thought, the body was already receiving the information. The ears were already adjusting. The depth of the sleep was already becoming something shallower, something more permeable, as though the boundary between the inner world and the outer one was gradually becoming less distinct. This is the part that is almost impossible to recover now, the way the body once woke itself, without being asked. There was no interruption, no sound designed to pull a person out of sleep against their will. The waking happened the way the night had happened. Gradually, and according to a rhythm that the body itself had been carrying all along, the sleeper would begin to surface, not because something had demanded it, but because the body had reached the natural far edge of what it needed, and was now of its own accord beginning to return. The light, when it finally came, arrived at the windows as something very faint and grey, not the full pale light of morning, but a kind of pre-light, a suggestion that the darkness was no longer complete. It would have gathered slowly at the edges of shutters, or through whatever small gaps existed in the walls or coverings. Not enough to see by, not yet, but enough to feel, enough that the room, which had been sealed so entirely for so many hours, began to feel slightly less enclosed, slightly more connected to whatever lay beyond its walls. The cold was often what a person noticed first, in the full sense of noticing. The fire had burned low hours before, and by this point in the early morning the warmth it had offered was largely gone. The air near the floor, near the walls, near any surface not occupied by a sleeping body, would have been quite chill. And the body, surfacing from sleep, would have registered this before registering almost anything else, a coolness against the face, the particular weight of whatever was covering them, the sensation of the surface beneath them, familiar and solid in a way that felt newly present after the long hours of dreaming. Waking in this way had a quality of arrival, not arrival at a new place, but a return to an existing one, the body settling back into the room, back into the morning, back into the particular arrangements of the life it had briefly left behind during the night. The others in the room would often still be sleeping, or perhaps beginning to stir, as the same gradual process was working through each of them according to their own internal measure. There would have been no alarm pulling everyone out at once, no single moment of general waking. It would have been staggered and unhurried, each person finding their way back to the surface at their own pace, the way individual ripples move outward from different points on still water. For some, the first waking moments would have been spent simply lying still, not reaching for anything, not beginning anything, just present in the dim and slowly brightening room, aware of the sounds outside growing more distinct, more birds now, and perhaps the first sounds of movement somewhere nearby, a neighbor beginning their morning, an animal shifting in a pen or stall. The world was assembling itself again, piece by piece, and there was no reason yet to do anything other than receive it. This kind of waking had something in it that is genuinely difficult to describe from inside the experience of modern mornings. It was not passive exactly, but it was unhurried in a way that went deeper than simply having more time. The body had been allowed to complete something. The night had run its full course, and what remained when that course was complete was a waking that felt, by most accounts that survive from this period, less like beginning and more like continuing. People who wrote about their mornings in letters and diaries from centuries past often described the early hour after waking with a kind of clarity that sounds almost foreign now. A sense of the mind being settled, of thoughts arriving without urgency, of the day not yet having made any demands, and the body not yet having been asked to move into anything. There was a quality of stillness in those first waking moments that was not the stillness of exhaustion, but of something genuinely completed. The grey light would have continued to deepen, slowly, from grey towards something warmer. The shapes in the room would have become more distinct, the outline of a window, the form of another person, the familiar arrangement of whatever objects occupied the space. The world was returning its colours in the order it always returned them, and there was something in that gradual revelation that was simply part of the morning, not a backdrop to it, but the morning itself, unfolding in its own time. Outside, the sounds would have continued to layer. By the time the light had grown enough to see by, the world beyond the walls would have been alive in a way it had not been an hour before. Birds in full voice now, the first human sounds of the day. Beginning somewhere in the distance, the particular quality of early morning air moving through whatever landscape surrounded the house. A village waking was a slow and organic sound, each part of it beginning in its own time, building toward something that was not noise but presence, the sense of a world resuming. There were those, of course, for whom dawn meant something different, those who had not been sleeping at all, who had spent the night moving through it, rather than resting inside it. The watchman at the end of his long circuit, the baker whose work had begun in the deepest part of the night, the midwife making her way home through the early grey light, the night's work behind her. For them, dawn was not a return but a release. The moment when the world they had been alone inside finally opened back up and filled again with other people, other sounds, other lives resuming around them. Their relationship with the morning was a different one, shaped by a different kind of night. What that night had asked of them, what it meant to move through the darkness while others slept, to be awake in the hours that belonged to no one, was its own particular world, one that most people never entered, and many regarded with a mixture of respect and quiet unease. But for those who woke with the gradual light, who surfaced from the second sleep as the birds began and the grey gathered at the windows, the morning arrived as mornings had always arrived, not as a demand, but as an opening, something the body recognized and moved toward, without being told. The day would begin slowly. It would begin with the particular quality of light that existed before any fire had been relit, while the room still held the cool and quiet of the night just past. And then, gradually, the fire would be coaxed back to life. The room would begin to warm, the sounds inside would begin to join the sounds outside, and the long sealed world of the night would open gently and without ceremony into the ordinary and unhurried morning. What that opening held was something that required no effort to move through. It simply happened, the way the light happened, the way the birds happened, one thing following another in the order they had always followed, unhurried and without interruption. There was no moment of having to decide to be awake. The waking had already occurred, somewhere in the gradual process of the light changing and the sounds gathering, and by the time a person was fully present in the morning, they had already been easing toward it for some time. The transition was so gentle that its beginning was impossible to locate. It had no edge, and the body, having slept in the way the body was built to sleep in two long portions with the quiet hour folded between them, would have carried none of the heaviness that comes from being pulled out of rest before it is finished. The tiredness that many people now carry into their mornings, that sense of something incomplete, would simply not have been there. The night had done what it came to do. The morning, then, was not a recovery from the night. It was its natural continuation, the same long rhythm, moving without interruption from the first fading of the light, all the way through to this soft and unhurried return, each part of it belonging to the same unbroken whole. And while most people were only now beginning to stir, there were others who had never stopped moving, who had spent the whole of those dim hours outside, awake, watching over a world that did not know it was being watched. The watchmen were already out there. They had been since the last light faded, since the moment when the village or the town or the city had drawn inward and gone still, and the long hours that belonged to no one had begun, while the households settled into their first sleep, while the fires were banked and the candles extinguished, and the breathing of the room grew slow and even. These men were already walking, already moving through streets that no one else was willing to enter. There is something worth staying with in that image for a moment. A man walking alone through a town that has gone entirely silent, carrying a lantern whose light reaches only a few feet in any direction. On all sides, a stillness so complete that the buildings would have been barely visible, shapes rather than structures, suggestions of walls and rooftops dissolving softly upward into the dim. And this was not an occasional thing, not a rare circumstance. This was the work. This was every night, in every season, in every kind of weather. The watchman walked because someone had to. His voice was one of the few sounds the sleeping town would hear. At regular intervals through the night, he would call the hour, announcing to anyone who happened to be awake what time it was and what the conditions were. Fair night, cloudy, cold and still. The calls were not loud. but in the silence of those hours they would have carried a long way, passing through shuttered windows and the walls of sleeping houses, arriving in dim interiors, as something between a reassurance and a reminder. Someone was out there. The night was being attended to. The watchman's role was older than most of the towns he walked through. It had existed in some form for as long as people had gathered together in settlements large enough to require watching. Fire was the first concern, always fire, in towns built of timber and thatch, where a single unattended flame could move from one house to the next before anyone had time to respond. He was also watching for figures that should not be there, for movement in places that should have been still. His presence was a kind of membrane between the sleeping world and whatever the night might otherwise allow. But the watchman was not the only one awake. In the bakeries, and in larger towns there were always bakeries, the work had already begun by the deepest hours of the night. Bread required time. The ovens required time to reach the warmth that bread demanded, and that warmth required fuel. And the whole long process had to be measured backward from the moment when the first customers would arrive in the early morning, wanting something warm. So the baker's night began, not at dawn, but long before it. In the same hours when the watchman was calling his second or third round, the baker was already moving through the dim interior of the bakehouse, by firelight, already surrounded by the warmth and the smell that would eventually drift out into the cold street above. There was a particular stillness to that kind of work. Not an unpleasant stillness, perhaps, but a real one. The baker knew that the world outside was sleeping. He could feel it in the quality of the silence. A silence different from the silence of an empty street during the day, heavier and more complete, as though the absence of people was not merely something physical, but had settled into the air itself. He worked inside that silence, and the fire worked beside him, and the hours passed in the way that hours pass, when there is nothing to measure them against, except the slow and gradual progress of the work. The midwife moved differently. She did not have a fixed place to be, or a fixed hour to begin. Her night began when someone came to her door, a husband, a neighbor, a servant sent running through the lanes with a lantern, and from that moment she was already in motion, gathering what she needed, stepping out into whatever the night had become, rain or frost or still cold air, familiar streets made strange by the darkness and the hour. She had made this journey many times, and she would make it many more, and she had long since stopped thinking of it as unusual. The night was simply where her work sometimes took her. She carried her own light, or she was guided by whoever had come to find her, and as she moved through the sleeping streets, she would have passed the watchman, perhaps exchanged a few words, the two of them briefly sharing the particular fellowship of people who are awake when others are not. There was a small world within the night, a world of the few who were moving while the many were still, and its inhabitants knew one another, at least by presence if not by name. The baker's light visible through a high window, the watchman's lantern swinging at the end of the lane, the midwife's figure moving with purpose toward a house where a candle had been lit and left burning. These people carried something that most of their neighbors never had occasion to develop, a knowledge of the night from the inside, not from within a warm and shuttered room, surfacing briefly and then returning to sleep, but from out in it, from the streets and the lanes and the fields between settlements, in all its moods and all its conditions. They knew what the stillness looked like at different hours, how it shifted between midnight and the hour before dawn, how the quality of the silence gradually began to ease as the night moved toward morning. They knew the sounds that belonged to the night and the sounds that did not. They were, in a way that most people were not, genuinely fluent in it. And what they moved through was not empty. The night had its own population, not only the human few who worked within it, but animals whose rhythms ran counter to the human day, sounds that had no obvious source, movements at the edges of lantern light that resolved into something ordinary, or did not resolve at all. The watchman learned to distinguish between the sounds that required attention and the sounds that did not. The midwife learned to navigate by landmarks that were invisible in the dim, by the feel of a road underfoot, by memory and familiarity rather than by sight. These were skills that most people never needed, because most people, once the darkness fell, stayed inside. The regard that settled around these night workers was a layered thing. There was respect in it, a recognition that what they did was necessary, that the sleeping world depended on them in ways it rarely acknowledged. But there was also something else, something quieter and harder to name. The night had always carried associations that daylight did not, and the people who inhabited it regularly were touched by those associations whether they sought it or not. To be at ease in the dim, to move through it without hesitation, was not entirely ordinary. It set a person slightly apart from the common experience in a way that was noticed, even when it was rarely spoken about. The hours they kept were the hours that most people only passed through briefly, surfacing from sleep, lying still in the dim, and then returning. But for the watchman, the baker, the midwife, those hours were not a pause between two sleeps. They were the whole of the working night, stretching from one end to the other, held together by lantern light and the sound of their own footsteps, and the knowledge that somewhere, in the houses around them, the world was resting. And when the first grey began to gather at the eastern edge of the sky, that slow, almost imperceptible shift from one shade of stillness to another, it was these people who saw it first, not as a relief exactly, but as a kind of arrival, the night releasing its hold by degrees, the darkness becoming something that could be seen through, rather than something that simply ended all sight. The watchman would make one final round. The baker's first loaves would be nearing their finish. The midwife might be making her way home through streets that were just beginning to take shape again around her, the buildings reassembling themselves softly out of the dissolving dim. The night had been full. It had been attended to, moved through, worked within, and now it was ending in the way it always ended, not with a clear boundary, but with a slow and gradual return of the visible world, the same unhurried process that had been unfolding every morning for as long as there had been mornings to unfold. The night workers were already weary. The rest of the world was only beginning to stir. But the night they had moved through was not only a place of work and watching, it was also a place of older and less manageable things, of sounds that arrived without explanation, of fears that the daylight kept at a comfortable distance, but that the darkness allowed to move much closer. The watchman knew this too, in his way, and so did everyone who lay in the dim between one sleep and the next, listening to what the house had to say when nothing else was making any sound at all. The house had its own voice at night, not a voice made of words, but of small and patient sounds that the daytime covered over without anyone noticing, until the daytime was gone, and the sounds were all that remained. A beam settling somewhere in the upper floor, the faint movement of something in the thatch, the way a door that had been closed for hours would breathe very slightly against its frame, as if the wood itself were remembering the warmth of the afternoon and slowly releasing it into the cold. During the day, none of this was audible. There was too much else happening. Voices, footsteps, the movement of animals outside, the general hum of a world in motion. But when the dim came fully down, and the last ember in the hearth had softened to something barely orange, the house began to speak in the only register it had, and the people lying within it listened, whether they wished to or not. This was one of the quieter fears of the pre-electric night, not the great dramatic fears that history tends to remember, but the smaller, more persistent one, the knowledge that the house around you was full of sounds you could not always explain. A creak became a question, a settling became something to be considered. The mind, lying still in the dimness, would turn each small sound over carefully, the way you might turn an object in your hands to understand its shape. Fire was the fear that sat closest, not as an abstract worry, but as a very present and practical one, because fire was also the only warmth, the only light, the only way of preparing food, and it lived inside the house alongside the family. Contained but never entirely still, the hearth was banked at night, the embers covered with ash to hold them low and slow until morning. This was done carefully, with the same attention you might give to something that had the potential to become dangerous if left unattended. Because it did. A spark carried on a draught, a coal that had not been properly covered, thatch above a beam that had grown dry through a long summer. These were not distant possibilities. They were the reasons that people in many households kept someone awake through the earliest hours, or woke at intervals during the night to check that the fire had remained where it was supposed to remain. The fear of fire was so woven into ordinary life that it shaped the way houses were built, the way neighborhoods were organized, the way towns appointed watchmen. A fire in a densely built town did not stay in one building for long. The houses were close, the materials were old and dry, and water was not something that arrived without effort. By the time a fire had become visible from the street, it had often already moved well beyond the room where it began. The watchman's lantern was not only a light to see by, it was a symbol of the vigilance that the night required, because the night was when fire, left unwatched, could take everything. Animals were another matter, and here too, the fear was not superstition, but simple geography. Wolves had not yet retreated from the edges of settled land in much of Europe. Foxes moved through villages without hesitation. Rats were a constant presence in any structure that stored grain or food, and they were not quiet in their work. The sounds of animals inside a wall, or beneath a floor, or moving across a roof, were familiar enough that most people knew them well. But familiarity did not entirely remove the unease. Knowing what was making a sound and feeling at ease about it were two different things, and in the full dim of a winter night with the walls very close and the ceiling very low, even a known sound could feel like something that required attention. Beyond the walls, in the lanes and fields and the spaces between settlements, larger animals moved freely. A horse left in a paddock might be gone by morning, not taken, simply frightened and wandered. Livestock kept outside required protection that was not always enough, and for anyone who had reason to be outdoors in the night hours, a midwife returning from a distant house, a messenger traveling between towns, the darkness outside the narrow reach of a lantern was genuinely and practically unknown. Not metaphorically unknown, simply unlit, and therefore unseeable, and therefore full of whatever the imagination chose to place there alongside whatever was actually present. Illness was perhaps the most intimate of the night's fears, because it arrived without sound and without warning. The connection between night air and sickness was something people believed in deeply, not without reason, since many of the diseases that moved through communities did seem to worsen in the dim hours, and since the body's temperature and vulnerability do shift during sleep in ways that were observable even without any understanding of why. Windows were kept closed, doors were sealed against the draught. The night air was treated as something to be kept out, not invited in, because the night had a way of carrying things that the daylight seemed to soften away. When someone in the house was already ill, the night became a kind of vigil. The person who lay awake between one sleep and the next, that quiet middle hour, would listen for changes in breathing from across the room, a cough that had deepened, a fever that had climbed. Illness in a world without swift treatment moved at its own pace, and that pace was often nocturnal, worsening in the small hours, and sometimes resolving by morning, and sometimes not. To lie in the dim beside someone who was unwell was to exist in a particular kind of alertness, not the alertness of worry exactly, but of attention held very still, waiting, and underneath all of these practical fears was something harder to name, a quality that came simply from living inside a world that went genuinely, completely, and unavoidably dim every single evening. There was no gradual adjustment to it, no choice about whether to enter it. The dim came, and you were inside it, and it would remain until the light returned on its own terms. This was not something people spoke about at length, because it required no explanation. Everyone shared it, in the same way that everyone shared the cold or the wet, or the hunger that could come in a long winter. It was simply a condition of existence. But conditions of existence shape the inner life in ways that are not always visible from the outside. The people who lay in those dim rooms, listening to the house and the animals, and the breathing of the people beside them, were not simply waiting for morning. They were inhabiting a relationship with the night that was older and more layered than anything we carry now. The darkness was not an inconvenience to be managed with a switch. It was a presence. It had weight and duration and its own particular quality of silence, and living inside it, night after night, from childhood onward, made it familiar in the way that difficult things become familiar when there is no alternative, not comfortable, exactly, but known, held at a certain distance, respected in the way you respect something that has always been larger than you. The fears were real. The sounds were real. The fire, and the animals, and the illness were real. But so was the long practice of enduring them, of lying still within them, of finding the edges of sleep again on the other side of whatever the night had brought through. And there was a kind of knowledge in that, earned slowly over generations, about what the dim actually contained and what it only seemed to contain, and how to tell the difference between the two when the house was quiet and the embers were low, and the world outside had grown as still as it was ever going to be. It was inside that stillness, that well-worn, slightly uneasy, deeply familiar stillness, that the human relationship with night had lived for most of human history. And then, not slowly but with a speed that the centuries before it could never have imagined, something arrived that changed it entirely. Not a fear, not a season, not a disease, or a fire, or a sound in the walls. Something that simply made the darkness optional for the first time, and in doing so, changed not only the night, but the sleep that had always lived inside it. The sounds a house made in full darkness were their own kind of language, and most people learned it the way you learn anything you live inside of long enough, not by studying it, but by simple proximity. The creak of a particular beam that always shifted in the cold, the way the thatch above settled under the weight of rain, a door that moved slightly in wind even when latched, producing a sound that was almost but not quite the sound of something opening. These were not alarming, most of the time. They were the house speaking in its ordinary voice, and the people inside it had long since learned to hear the difference between that voice and something else. What remained, even after all that familiarity, was a low and patient wariness that never entirely dissolved. Not dread. Something quieter than dread, more like the feeling of knowing that the world beyond the walls was large and dim and indifferent, and that the walls themselves were not as solid as daylight made them seem. The dim had a way of reminding people of their smallness, not harshly, but simply honestly, and perhaps that honesty was part of what was lost, along with the two-sleep pattern and the long middle hour and the particular silence of a world that had not yet learned to burn through the night. The change did not announce itself. It arrived the way most permanent things do, gradually, and then all at once, spreading from city to city, the way light itself spreads, filling in the edges of what had always been dim, and letting very little remain untouched. It began in the mills and the factories, where the hours of labor were no longer governed by the sun. Artificial light made it possible to work past dark, and so working past dark became expected, and then ordinary, and then required. The body's old agreement with the sun, that agreement written over so many thousands of years of living inside the rhythm of light and darkness, began slowly to loosen, not because anyone decided it should, simply because the evening no longer ended when the light did. The candle had always been too expensive to burn carelessly through the night. The oil lamp, too, was a thing used with care and deliberateness, lit when needed and allowed to go out when the need had passed. But the gas lamp and then the electric light carried no such weight. They were not precious. They did not have to be tended or rationed. They simply stayed on, for as long as anyone wished, and the darkness that had once been the most reliable thing in a human life became something you could choose to delay, and then delay a little more, and then, in time, almost entirely. Bedtime shifted, not in a single season, but across generations, slowly at first, and then more steadily. The hour at which ordinary people went to sleep moved later and later into the evening, where a household might once have settled into the dim not long after sunset. Now there were things to do in the light, reading, visiting, simply sitting with the lamp burning because the lamp could burn, and there was no reason to let it go out. The evening stretched in a way it never had before, and the body, which had always followed the light, followed this new light instead. The two-sleep pattern dissolved inside that shift. It did not vanish in a single night. It simply became less necessary, and then less common, and then, within a few generations, so rare that people forgot it had ever existed. The long middle hour, that quiet, private, wordless space between first sleep and second sleep, faded from ordinary life without anyone marking its passing. There was no moment at which someone said, "This is the last generation that will wake in the middle of the night and lie still in the dim by habit." It simply stopped, the way a language stops when the last people who grew up inside it are gone. What replaced the two-sleep pattern was the single long block of sleep that most people now consider natural, 7 or 8 hours, unbroken, beginning late in the evening and ending with an alarm or the demands of a schedule. This feels ordinary because it is what we have always known. But it is, in the long span of human history, a very recent arrangement. The body that carries it is the same body that once woke in the middle of the night, as a matter of course, lay quietly in the dim for an hour, and then returned to sleep without distress. That capacity did not disappear. It was simply given nothing to respond to anymore, and so it went still. The way a habit goes still when the conditions that shaped it no longer exist. There is something worth sitting with in that, the way a thing can be lost not through any decision, but simply through the slow removal of the circumstances that made it possible. No one chose to end the watch. No one looked at the quiet waking hour and decided it was no longer needed. The light simply came, and the dark retreated, and the hour went with it, and life continued, and no one particularly noticed what had left. The relationship with dreams shifted too, in its own quiet way. When second sleep had carried its own weight, when the hours before dawn were understood as a different kind of time, a time when the boundary between the waking world and whatever lay beyond it was thought to be thinner. Dreams had a significance that is difficult to fully recover now. They were attended to, written down, discussed, brought to people who were known to understand them. In a world lit through the night and governed by schedules and the steady forward movement of industrial time, that kind of attention became harder to sustain. The dream was still there, but the long, unhurried morning in which to hold it, to turn it over, to let it mean something, that became rarer, and then rarer still. The night itself changed in character. For most of human history, it had been a place, a real and present place, with its own sounds and textures and consolations. Something you moved into when the light went out, and moved back out of when the light returned. The arrival of artificial light did not simply brighten the night, it altered what the night was. It made the night continuous with the day in a way it had never been before. Something you passed through rather than something you inhabited. The watchman calling the hours, the baker moving through the pre-dawn streets, the midwife making her way between houses in the dim. These figures had existed at the edge of ordinary life, their nighttime work understood as unusual, even slightly apart from the everyday. Now the night became available to everyone, and the strangeness of being awake inside it gradually dissolved. What was lost is not easy to name precisely, because it was not a single thing. It was a texture, a quality of time that no longer exists in the same form, the particular weight of a night that was genuinely dim, genuinely still, genuinely separate from what came before and after it. The two-sleep pattern was one part of that texture, the shared warmth of a bed was another. The low fire, the careful candle, the sounds of a house settling into itself in the cold, all of it formed something that was simply the ordinary experience of being human after the sun went down, for longer than anyone now alive can trace. It is not that the world before electricity was better. The fears were real, and the cold was real, and the illnesses that moved through the night were real, and no one who lived inside all of that would have chosen to keep it simply for the sake of keeping it. The light was welcomed, the warmth was welcomed, the safety was welcomed. None of that is in question. But something went with the darkness when the darkness retreated, and it went quietly enough that most people never had the chance to say goodbye to it. The long middle hour, the particular quality of second sleep, the way a dream felt in the early morning when there was nothing yet to do but lie still and let it remain, the sound of a house in full stillness, familiar and slightly uneasy and deeply known. These were not hardships, they were simply the shape of a night that no longer exists, and the shape of a sleep that no longer exists inside it. The body still carries something of what it once knew. There are people who wake in the middle of the night and lie quietly for an hour without distress, not knowing why, finding the dim oddly comfortable rather than troubling. There are people whose most vivid dreams come just before dawn, in that last long stretch of sleep that was once its own separate thing. The old pattern has not entirely vanished from the body. It has simply been given very little room to move in, and so it moves very quietly, in whatever space it can find. And perhaps that is where this story settles, not in loss, exactly, but in the quiet recognition that the night was once something we lived inside of, rather than something we kept at a distance, that sleep was once two things with a waking space between them, that the dim, for most of human history, was not an absence but a presence, familiar and patient and full of its own kind of company. We carry that history in us, even now, even here, even in the warm and well-lit rooms where we find ourselves at the end of a long evening, not far from sleep. The light that came with the industrial age did not arrive all at once. It moved gradually, the way most large changes move, first into the cities, then outward along the roads, then into the smaller towns and the quieter places, until the darkness that had once been simply the nature of evening became something that required effort to find. Gas lamps came first, then electric ones, and with each new source of light the night grew a little thinner, a little less itself. Bedtimes shifted later, almost without anyone noticing. When the evening could be extended, when there was light enough to read, to work, to gather, people stayed awake longer, and the early sleeping hour that had once followed naturally from the falling dark simply moved further away. Sleep was gathered into whatever remained of the night, and the body, patient and steady, arranged itself around the new shape of things. What had taken centuries to build dissolved within a few generations, not because it was unwanted, but because the conditions that had held it in place were gently, steadily removed. The way a riverbed changes when the water finds a new path, and the old channel fills in slowly with silt and silence. And after a while it is difficult to see that anything had ever flowed there at all. Thank you for being here tonight. Good night.